Asserting central presence immediately, this opens a path for development and sets up potential queenside pressure. Immediately establishing central pawn presence mirrors white's intent, creating a balanced starting battleground. Developing a knight to its most active square prepares kingside castling and exerts influence over central squares. Developing the knight to a central square bolsters the pawn chain and prepares for kingside castling, creating a solid defensive structure. Challenging central control, this pawn advance immediately fights for space and opens lines for your pieces. Solidifying the center while preparing to develop the kingside, bishop opens up harmonious piece play for black. Shaping the kingside for a fianchetto, preparing to control the long diagonal and support a queenside expansion. Embracing the gambit, black offers a temporary pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially free their own pieces for rapid development and active counterplay. Threatening the isolated pawn immediately, this offers a chance for white to disrupt black's pawn structure early. Protecting the pawn while repositioning the queen allows for future development and avoids immediate material loss. Recapturing the pawn with the queen loosens white's kingside pawn structure, potentially creating targets later. Shifting the queen avoids immediate danger, but surrenders central influence and allows white queen to dominate the queenside. Reinforcing the center's influence, the knight seeks to join the queenside pressure while solidifying the d-pawn's defense. Unburdening your queen simplifies the position, but surrenders dynamic counterplay and central influence. Recapturing the pawn with the knight now reestablishes piece harmony and prepares for central control. Liberating the bishop to this active square pressures the knight and opens lines for counterplay. Developing the bishop cleanly solidifies white's queenside pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling, aiming for a harmonious setup. The bishop's trade simplifies black's position, initiating an endgame where piece activity will be paramount. Reclaiming the knight initiates a central pawn structure and prepares to contest control of the d-file. Developing the knight to c6 offers solid central influence and prepares for queenside expansion, asserting black's presence. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling creates a stable pawn structure and opens lines for development. Unleashing the knight to b4 disrupts white's developing rhythm, eyeing the c2 pawn and preparing for a more active central presence. Shifting the king to safety addresses potential checks while preparing to centralize pieces. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, threatening the knight and preparing for castle. Unveiling the kingside, white aims to connect pieces and activate their own bishop's diagonal. Developing the bishop to an active square, this move prepares to contest the open c-file while eyeing potential weaknesses on the queen side. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure defensively aims to prevent immediate tactical disruptions and prepare for a slow positional buildup. Preparing to challenge the central pawn structure and potentially reroute the knight to a more active square, this maneuver aims to improve black's piece mobility. Securing the queen side, white prepares to challenge black's bishop's activity and potential pawn advances. Challenging the knight's centralized position, this knight maneuver prepares to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened kingside. Provoking a central pawn skirmish, this thrust immediately challenges the knight's secure outpost and begins to gain breathing room in white's cramped position. The knight decisively advances, contesting central squares and threatening further disruption to white's cramped queenside. Suddenly, white's knight leaps forward, creating immediate pressure on black's queenside and disrupting any quiet development. A decisive check that forces further pawn structure concessions, potentially opening a crucial line for white's queen. Seeking to consolidate your central presence after the knight's foray, this repositioning prioritizes kingside safety. Castling queenside now injects immediate attacking possibilities, but also exposes the king. Asserting control over the vital c-file opens avenues for future pressure and potentially disrupts black's queenside development. Steering the knight towards the queenside offers a chance to redeploy it, perhaps challenging white's centralized pieces or securing a safer outpost. Stabilizing the queenside pawn structure and preparing to contest the open files is the primary goal here. Unleashing the bishop onto the long diagonal subtly loosens white's grip on the queenside. Shifting the bishop creates a flexible defensive screen and prepares for potential kingside development, seeking to improve piece harmony. Realigning knights to control central squares, a solidifying maneuver. Striking at the pinned knight immediately opens lines for your pieces. Reclaiming the outpost on c6 solidifies the bishop's influence, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially exploit the open files. Securing the queenside pawn advances the initiative. Shifting the bishop to the 8th rank prepares for potential queen infiltrations and solidifies the kingside. Pushing this pawn aggressively creates space on the queenside, potentially trapping black's bishop and disrupting their defensive structure. Relocating the knight to the edge of the board relinquishes valuable central control and creates a passive outpost for it. Invading the queenside with this pawn advance aims to disrupt black's piece coordination and potentially open lines. Securing the knight's escape route, this pawn move prevents immediate tactical fireworks and prepares to reinforce the queenside. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain, preparing to wrestle for queenside space and restrict black's knight. Securing the king amidst the advancing pawns, this cautious maneuver prepares to activate dormant pieces from the queenside. Securing the c-file with the rook establishes immediate central influence and prepares for potential pawn advances. Consolidating the pawn structure is a wise, if slow, reaction to the cramped queenside. This redeployment aims to establish dominance over the central files, a crucial step towards activating the rook and potentially preparing a kingside attack. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure under fire from white's centralized pieces. Relocating the knight to b1 prepares its eventual redeployment to c3, aiming to challenge black's pawn structure and control key central squares. Re-establishing a defensive outpost on the bishop's former square, this bishop aims to bolster the queenside pawn structure and eye white's advanced pawns. Targeting the queenside pawn chain with potential for a queenside expansion. Finally liberating the knight from its passive post, the black horse prepares to jump into the fray. Opening the queenside flank now aggressively carves out vital space for the knight. Snatching the pawn opens lines, but exposes the knight to potential harassment and disrupts black's pawn structure. Prizes the active bishop for a crucial outpost, setting up favorable exchanges. Opening the c-file now offers a direct assault route on the enemy king and promises greater piece activity. A bold push, aiming to dominate the c-file and restrict black's mobility with the rook. Challenging the open file now offers some counterplay and prevents white from fully dominating the queenside pressure. Unleashing a discovered attack, the rook infiltrates black's queenside fortifications and forces a king move, disrupting their pawn structure. King's safety is paramount. Bringing the monarch to a slightly more secure square avoids immediate tactical pitfalls. A bold exchange opens a decisive pathway for white's rook, threatening to unravel black's defenses. The rook captures the rook, clearing the c-file and initiating an endgame where the remaining rook pair on the queenside will be crucial. Gaining space and eliminating threats on the queenside, this knight maneuver aims to restrict black's rook activity. Seeking to activate the rook, this rook lift aims to leverage the open c-file and create immediate threats against white's exposed king. Sacrificing the rook opens a precarious diagonal towards black's king, threatening a swift, decisive attack. Securing the kingside with a timely pawn advance, this defensive maneuver aims to prevent further penetration by white's pieces. Seizing the open file with the rook forces a difficult choice, as the king is now exposed. Fleeing the discovered attack, the king desperately seeks safety, but its position remains precariously exposed. Seeking active piece play, white forces the enemy king to a precarious central square, aiming to exploit potential mating nets. King's desperate flight to the edge of the board, hoping for a safe haven from the looming threats. Initiating another check forces the black king back to the same square, preventing any immediate defensive regrouping. King's flight path now appears much safer, avoiding further immediate checks from the rook. Sacrificing the rook opens a critical pathway for the king, aiming to force a decisive endgame advantage by activating dormant pieces. King's safety remains paramount as black reiterates the position, hoping white doesn't find a decisive tactical blow. Pushing pawns forward like this opens up your own king to danger and offers no immediate compensation. Opening lines around the black king is the primary consequence, inviting further pressure. Daringly advances the d-pawn, creating central infiltration potential and forcing a difficult decision for black's king. Seeking to activate the rooks, black challenges the open d-file and eyes potential pawn weaknesses on white's queenside. Challenging the black king's safety after an exchange, this maneuver seeks to disrupt the opponent's coordination and exploit their exposed position. King's exposure intensifies, better to seek refuge from that relentless battery. Forcing the black king into another passive check, preparing to push the passed pawn and claim the file. The king seeks refuge along the 8th rank, a passive retreat amidst the encroaching enemy pawns. Seizing the exposed king's path creates immediate tactical pressure. The rook's newfound dominance on the 7th rank suffocates black's development. Seizing the open file with the rook creates immediate mating threats around white's king. Exchanging rooks here simplifies the position into a winning rook and pawn endgame for white due to the advanced passed pawn. A stark simplification unfolds, leaving white with a significant material advantage that should easily convert. Sacrificing the pawn to usher the king into a more active, albeit exposed, position, aiming to seal the deal quickly. Sacrificing the rook opens a dangerous promotion path for the pawn, threatening immediate checkmate. Exploiting the exposed king with a swift royal check, forcing further positional concessions. The king abandons its protective pawn shield, seeking refuge but exposing itself to the encroaching white knight. Clearing a path for the knight to aggressively infiltrate black's weakened queenside. The black king's precarious position demands immediate attention to avoid being overwhelmed by white's encroaching pawns and knight. Seizing the remaining pawn with the knight opens a clear path to victory, leveraging superior material. Threatening the king directly after forcing the rook exchange is a classic way to exploit unleashed aggression in the endgame. Securing the monarch becomes paramount as the rook sweep culminates in a check. Protecting the rook and regrouping the defenses offers the best chance to survive this difficult endgame. Building a central pawn presence now, aiming to restrict black's knight and prepare for further advances. Challenging the central pawn structure with the rook opens lines, a bold attempt to stir chaos in this endgame. Hounding the black king with knight advances initiates a chase across the board, seeking to exploit the pawn's advance. Shifting the king towards the center aims to support the rooks and pawns as the endgame consolidates. Leveraging the pawn's new outpost creates immediate attacking potential on the king's side. Exposing the king to potential checks while neglecting central pawn structure feels quite perilous here. Capturing the pawn immediately opens the h-file, creating immediate threats against the black king. Offering a pawn to establish the knight on a dominant square, the king now faces a dangerous open diagonal. Unleashing the knight to its outpost aims to disrupt black's defensive structure. Desperate kingside harassment begins, seeking any flicker of initiative before black's material advantage solidifies. King now exposed on the kingside, creating a decisive tactical vulnerability. Sacrificing the rook to open a path for the knight, hoping to exploit white's exposed king. Recapturing the pawn initiates a calculated endgame scenario, aiming to exploit the exposed black king. Consolidating the rook's position offers defensive support for the beleaguered king. Unleashing the pawn's potential now, forcing black to react to the advancing threat.